Hi guys, welcome back to The Wargamer, and in this video we're going to be talking about basing. Now basing is an often overlooked part of miniature painting, and it's a real shame because it can really make or break your miniature. If you have a good base, it can really help to improve a fairly mediocre paint scheme, and equally a really excellent paint scheme can really be spoilt and let down by a pretty bland or poorly implemented base. So in this series of videos that I'm planning on doing, I'm going to be exploring different techniques for basing, different materials, different styles, different themes, and each one will be different. But this video is actually going to be giving you a foundation as to how you can go about basing your miniatures. We're going to be talking about the basics of miniature basing. So for this video, you will need the following items. Some sand. What I have here is two different sizes of bird sand that can be easily picked up for little cost from many shops such as supermarkets and pet stores. I'm using Wilko's bird sand for any Brits that are watching. Some glue. Any PVA or white glue can be used, but I'll be using World Scenics static grass glue as it dries pretty quickly and is strong enough to hold down the sand. Some brushes, preferably some older ones. The basing we're doing in this video isn't going to be particularly precise, so you don't want to ruin your nice Kolinsky sable brushes. Some paints. You will need some earthy browns, a stone colour and a brown wash. Feel free to use your own choice of manufacturer, but I'll be using these Citadel paints. Some static grass. Again, I'm using World Scenics 2mm Summer on the left and their awesome 4mm on the right. And finally, a base to actually apply our sand and grass to. To start off with, we want to glue some sand to our base, and for this, we'll need our glue and an old brush. Depending on the thickness of your glue, you will need to mix in a little water until you have a consistency that is a little thicker than paint. You can then apply this glue over the entirety of the base. With your base covered in glue, we can now apply the sand. First of all, we want to sprinkle on some of our fine gravel sparingly around the base. This will create the effect of larger rocks strewn across the ground, and of course, the more rocks you apply, the rockier the ground will appear. After applying the fine gravel and with the glue still wet, we can now start to sprinkle on some of our finer sand. This fine sand will act as the soil or general dirt that we have on the ground. Once your whole base has been covered, you can then lightly tap away any of the loose particles. At this stage, you may find that there are some areas that you've missed with the glue, but you can quite easily touch this up with a little more glue. After allowing your glue to dry thoroughly, the length of time will depend on the glue you're using. We now want to brush away any excess sand. Using a large soft brush, you can remove any particles that may have become loosely stuck to the base. This will ensure that they don't become loose after you've finished painting. Before we move on to painting, you may need to remove some areas of the sand that have become accidentally stuck to the sides of the base or the miniature itself. These mistakes can be easily rectified by using a sharp blade to scrape away the glue and the sand. As you can probably already see, I tend to do all of this basing after I have assembled and glued my miniature to the base, but before I prime my miniatures. This way you can prime your base at the same time that you prime the rest of the miniature, which just saves a lot of time later on. At this stage, we have a base that consists of just sand and has been primed, and in true Blue Peter fashion, here is one I made earlier. Now this base does not have a miniature attached to it, so you guys can see the painting process a little more easily, but these techniques will still apply even if your attached miniature hasn't already been painted. The first layer of paint will be the base coat, and for this you'll want to use a medium brown colour. I'm using Games Workshop Steel Legion Drab. You'll want to mix this paint with some water in roughly equal quantities to make the paint easier to work with. Using our medium brown paint, we now want to cover the entirety of the base. Here you can see the importance of thinning with water as we're able to get the paint in and around all of those grains of sand much more easily. If there is a miniature attached to your base, then be careful not to overspill. Once covered, leave your paint to dry for a few minutes before moving on to the next step. The next layer of paint will be slightly lighter than the first, and for this I'm using Games Workshop's Baneblade Brown. Instead of painting the whole base, this time we will be dry brushing. To dry brush, take some paint on the tip of your brush and remove some of the paint onto a tissue until only a small amount is left in the bristles. Then we can lightly drag our brush across the entire surface of the base, which will cause the paint to accumulate on the raised sand, which will not only lighten our base's overall colour, but also give it much more depth and detail. When dry brushing with a miniature on your base, you may need to use a slightly smaller brush than the one I'm using here. Using the same dry brushing technique as before, we now want to pick out any of the larger rocks using a grey paint. In my case, I'll be using Mechanicus Standard Grey from Games Workshop. By having the two colours on our base like this will create a much more interesting and more realistic looking base. Our final dry brushing step will require a light tan paint, such as Games Workshop's Ushabti Bone. This will be a very light application of dry brushing over the brown areas in order to create some variation of colour on the ground surface. The final step in painting our base is to apply a dark brown wash. For this step, I'll be using Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop, but not straight out of the pot. Instead, I'll be mixing together roughly equal parts wash to water in order to reduce its strength. We can then apply our wash over the whole base. This wash will serve to unite the various layers of paint whilst also flowing into those recesses and creating shading, which will in turn help to enhance our level of realism. Once the paint on our bases has been allowed to dry, we can now move on to applying our static grass. I'll be using two different colours and lengths as I find this gives a much more realist effect than having grass that is all one colour and one height. Both of these grasses are from World Scenics, with the 4mm autumn grass on the right here, and on the left their 2mm summer grass as well. To fix our grass to our base, we again want to use our PVA glue. Again, you may need to water it down a little bit. Using a brush, paint on a few spots of glue where you want the grass to stick, and don't worry about the glue being white, as it will dry clear. You can then bring in your grass. First of all, I sprinkle on a small amount of our longer 4mm autumn grass, and then I'll cover the base with our shorter 2mm grass. This ensures that we get the grass to stick to all of our glue. Leave your glue to dry for a while. Again, the amount of time will depend on the glue that you're using, but once the glue has dried, we can then go about removing any excess grass from our base. This should reveal the grass that has become fixed to our base. Now you can either tap it off or use a light brush to gently brush away the remaining grass. And here we have the completed base. At this stage, I would then seal my model with a matte spray varnish, which will remove any shine from the glue and help to keep the grass in place. And so that concludes this first video on how to go about basing your miniatures. Now by now you should have a good grasp as to how to go about sanding, applying paint, and also static grass to your bases. And that style can be used across a whole range of different miniatures, be they historical, fantasy, or even sci-fi. So one of the things I would like to see from you guys is some suggestions for future basing tutorials. Now I want to see what kind of bases you would like to see me tackle, be they realistic or be they fantastical, and leave your suggestions in the comments below. And as always, if you're enjoying these videos, be sure to let me know in the comments below, and also make sure you subscribe to be kept up to date with all of my latest content. And finally, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, because it's you guys who make this whole new format video possible. I've been able to upgrade my equipment and also put more time into my videos, and that's all because of your guys' support. Now, if you're interested in supporting me as well, you can find out more details in the link in the description below. And so the only thing left to say is thanks for watching, and goodbye.